Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and it's a great pleasure for Desmond Lockman and me to welcome all of you to our conference on the international economic challenges facing the new Trump administration and what should be done about them. The relevant issues we need to consider are many, but they surely include how do the gains from international trade, which the United States has provided leadership about going back to the end of the Second World War, get balanced with public concerns and campaign statements about the costs of trade and globalization? How should the various regions of the world fit in to U.S. international economic policy? Asia, with the notable difficulties of China and Japan, Latin America, we might throw Puerto Rico and its debt and economic crisis in here as well. Europe, Italy's staggering banking problems, heightened by the new political uncertainty of yesterday's election. Deutsche Bank's problems, negative interest rates, Germany's persistent trade surpluses, Russia, and perhaps the fragmentation of the European Union. And what should the dollar policy of the new administration be? And have years of unorthodox monetary experimentation created a global mispricing of risk? And if so, what can be done about it at this point? To the panel, interest rate and market forecasts are welcome but not required. Overall, is the international economic outlook bright or dark as we are at this point in December with the Trump administration getting ready to take over and Congress organizing itself for a new session? Suggesting the dark view, our colleague Desmond Lockman has recently written, a dangerous combination of high global debt, gross mispricing of global credit risk, weak banks of systemic economic importance, and global economic default lines make it all too likely that the world is headed for a global economic crisis in another year or two. But perhaps other panelists will take a brighter view. We do have an outstanding panel to address these problems, issues, and proposed solutions, and let me briefly introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First will be Jeff Frankel, the James W. Harpel Professor of Capital Formation and Growth at Harvard University, who also directs the program, and maybe it's a problem too, the program in international finance and macroeconomics at the National Bureau of Economic Research, where he's on the Business Cycle Dating Committee. Jeff has served 2 stints on the Council of Economic Advisors, and his research interests include currencies, commodities, financial crises, international finance, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and international trade blocks. Everything we want to talk about today, Jeff. Next will be Ann Kruger, Senior Research Professor at the International Economics at the School for Advanced Studies at Johns Hopkins University, a Senior Fellow at the Stanford Center for International Development, and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Ann was previously First Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. A past president of the American Economic Association, she's published extensively on international finance and economic policy. Third will be Fred Bergston, Senior Fellow, Director Emeritus, and Founding Director of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Fred previously was Assistant Secretary for International Affairs of the U.S. Treasury and Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs and Assistant for Economic Affairs to Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council. He's a member of the President's Advisory Committee on Trade Policy and Negotiations and been Chairman of the Competitiveness Policy Council. My page on Greg just hid itself. Fourth will be Greg Ip, the chief economics commentator of the Wall Street Journal, where he covers U.S. and global economic developments and policy debates. Previously, Greg was U.S. economics editor of The Economist. He's the author of the Little Book of Economics and the intriguing book Foolproof, a discussion of the nature of risk and the often perverse results of human efforts at risk management. Greg is also the creator of Real-Time Economics, the Wall Street Journal's economics blog. And our last speaker, Desmond Lockman, has been a resident fellow at AEI since 2003, focusing on the global macroeconomy. Desmond writes extensively on international economics, financial crises, the dollar, ongoing strains in the euro area, the continuing debt crises of Greece and Puerto Rico, and the economic travails of Italy. Previously, he was managing director and chief emerging market strategist at Solomon Smith Barney and a deputy director at the International Monetary Fund. And Desmond is the organizer of this outstanding panel. Thank you, Desmond, for getting us all here today, and thank you all for being with us. Each of our distinguished panelists will speak for 13 to 15 minutes, after which we'll give them a chance to react to each other or clarify points of agreement or disagreement. After that, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 12 o'clock noon. Jeff, it's great to have you with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you for that introduction, Alex, and thanks to Desmond and AEI for inviting us and hosting us. Thank you all for coming. So our title is Global Economic Challenges for Donald Trump. There's something familiar in every 4 years having panels like this at eminent think tanks that offer advice for the incoming administration. Before we start, I feel the need this year to acknowledge something's a little different. Mr. Trump himself and the people who voted for him, I think, have made pretty clear that they don't actually want advice from us on our opinions of the state of the world and the new what they'll have to do. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I mean, that's I think we should show that we know that we understand that, and then we should proceed to try to make sense of the world as best we can. Anyway. Having acknowledged that uncomfortable fact, I think one can say that the incoming administration is likely to encounter events on the international stage and constraints on the international stage that it did not anticipate, or at least did not figure prominently in the campaign. This is a common pattern. If politicians campaign in poetry and govern in prose, presidential candidates often campaign domestically, and particularly governors for whom that's their background, and then find that when they go into the White House, they're dealing more with international issues, and that the international issues have constraints and developments different from what they anticipated. I think that process is going to be more extreme this time, but it is a familiar process. So. There were, of course, international economic issues in the campaign, international trade, the U.S. deficit, and the Chinese exchange rate did figure pretty prominently in the campaign. And that's where I'm going to focus my remarks in the time I have allotted. I hope and expect other panelists will give a more well-rounded view of what's going on around the world, such as the weekend's election results in Italy and so on. Let me start with Mr. Trump's promise to name China a currency manipulator. He says as soon as he takes office, it's really supposed to be you get to do it twice a year. But regardless, he may have to confront a reality here, or he may succeed in continuing to avoid confronting the reality. I don't know. But the reality is, and he's not the only one. I mean, many U.S. politicians, and I think some economists have, I would say, sort of been getting this wrong for 2 years. The fact is that the People's Bank of China has been intervening to resist the depreciation of the renminbi, to keep it up rather than to push it down for the last 2 years, since June 2014. I have a graph that I'll show you in in a moment. Now, of course, if you're selling dollar foreign exchange reserves and buying renminbi, that has the effect of keeping the value of the currency higher than it otherwise would be. If the Chinese were to take the advice of Mr. Trump and other U.S. politicians and to move to a freely market-oriented exchange rate, the renminbi would depreciate, would weaken rather than appreciate. There's natural forces for 2 or 3 years that have been working, market forces that have been working to push the currency down rather than up. Very much different than what was going on for the previous 10 years, where the market forces worked to push it up and the intervention dampened that. Market forces, I think by 5 years ago or so, the undervaluation of the renminbi had been eliminated. If anything, it was slightly overvalued. That's one factor. Another is that China's growth rate, the 10% growth rate that they had maintained on average for 3 decades, is probably a thing of the past. China has been slowing down for a while. They've eased monetary policy at a time when the Fed has ended quantitative easing and started to move towards tighter monetary policy. Those are all reasons why the fundamentals go down for the renminbi, and reasons why the intervention has been keeping it higher than it otherwise would be. Also, more recently, they put on reinstituted some capital controls on capital outflows. There again, the intent and the effect has been to slow the depreciation of the renminbi, and if they stop doing that, it would depreciate by more. And of course, that would make their exports more competitive and would worsen the trade balance vis-a-vis the U.S., which is presumably what our politicians are interested in. I don't know if you can, it's probably not big enough to read, actually, I now realize. Let's go to the graph. So this is Chinese holdings of foreign exchange reserves, especially dollars, but others. And of course, for 10 years, it was going up, up, up. It crossed the 1 trillion mark, and then 2 trillion, 3 trillion. It was almost at 4 trillion by June of 2014 when it peaked. And then for the last 2 years, it's been coming down. And the most recent numbers, as of just a few weeks ago, is they've spent $872 billion in foreign exchange reserves attempting to defend the renminbi, which has got to be by far the largest, quantitatively largest effort of any central bank ever to keep up the value of its currency. And once again, if we convince them to stop doing that, the currency is going to go down rather than up. All right, on to the U.S. Trade balance. Little known fact, the U.S. trade deficit has, as a share of GDP, has been narrowing over the last 10 years. I'll show you a graph of that in a moment. And then I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time talking about the likelihood that Mr. Trump's policies, it's hard to say what they're going to be, but as a best guess, are likely to widen the trade deficit, to return to a downward trend. And that's true even aside what I said about if we get our wish and they stop manipulating the currency, meaning intervening in the market, and the renminbi goes down further. Even if that doesn't happen, there's other reasons to think the U.S. trade deficit will widen. Here is the U.S. trade deficit, which had been on a downward trend for decades, 50 years really, but for the last 10 years has been on an upward trend. Narrowing the gap, trade balance improving. A lot of that, of course, happened during the recession when U.S. income fell and imports fell. But now we're back virtually to full employment, and the trade deficit is not back down to where it was before. So I think that's worth pointing out because it hasn't received much attention. Why do I say that Mr. Trump's policies are likely to make the trade deficit worse rather than better? Again, I have to make a qualifier here. I don't know what he's going to do. He has said many different things, and so it's hard to know for sure. But probably one of the of all the economic plans or talk, one of the ones that seems most likely, big important ones to happen, is fiscal expansion. I should say apparent plans for fiscal expansion, because we're not sure. But he's talked about massive tax cuts in corporate and income taxes, and also spending increases in areas such as military and infrastructure and some others. And it's hard to know what the carryover will be from the from statements that were made during the campaign to actual policies. But I think it's pretty likely to happen. Congress is pretty likely to support this one. There's different views about trade and entitlements and immigration, various other issues. But in the case of fiscal policy, it seems to me quite plausible that this will actually happen. Big tax cuts and big increases in spending. It would, after all, be a repeat of what happened when Ronald Reagan took office, and it would happen again when George W. Bush took office. In all these cases, I'll talk about deficit and debt, but actual actions to both on the tax front and the spending front that resulted in very large deficits, and Congress was happy to go along with it in those cases. Congressmen are always happy to give away money. That's always a lot easier than doing the opposite. Well, but the relevance of that, of course, is the connection between public saving, or the budget balance, and the current account. The budget deficit would almost certainly reduce national savings. And according to the national savings identity, that's pretty likely, unless it's fully offset by a fall in investment. It's pretty likely that that would worsen the current account deficit. It's an example of the so-called twin deficits phenomenon, which we also saw under Reagan and George W. Bush. In both cases, big increase in budget deficit, fall in national saving, and increase in the current account deficit and the trade deficit. All right, to some people that sounds pretty abstract. What is the connection? What's the causal mechanism? What's the channel that goes from a budget deficit to a trade deficit? Well, the standard one, I think, is quite plausible now, and it's already starting to happen. Fiscal expansion puts upward pressure on U.S. interest rates, and that's especially true when you're already pretty close to full employment, and the capacity of the economy you're up against the capacity of the economy. In addition, of course, the Fed was already widely expected to raise interest rates. December 14th, they're meeting, what's that, a week from Wednesday, I guess. Mm-hmm. And the recent developments in the economy suggest that they're more likely to do that and to follow up with further hikes in interest rates in 2017 and 2018. If I had to guess, the administration will probably oppose these increases in interest rates, whether through complaining or tweeting or the appointments they make. It makes. There's vacancies already, and Janet Yellen's got, a little over a year to go in her term. Now, some people might be surprised with this because Mr. Trump and the other candidates during the campaign, the Republican candidates, criticized the Fed rather sharply, saying monetary policy was too easy, and we should constrain them in various ways to prevent monetary policy from being so easy in the future, through some kind of mechanistic rule or gold standard, or some way constrain them. But my prediction is that that's going to all go by the wayside after January 20th, and that the pressure on the Fed will be in the opposite direction, that they will complain about the increases in interest rates. One hopes that the independence of the Fed will hold, as it has in the past. For example, in the 80s, when Paul Volcker was the one saying, you can increase, you can have your fiscal expansion, but we're keeping the money path where it is, the LM curve, in your ISLM analysis, and if that forces up interest rates, that's what's going to happen. So I guess you asked for forecasts. You said they might be welcome. This one's already begun to happen. Interest rates have gone up since the election. But the direct influence on the trade balance, of course, comes via the exchange rate. Higher interest rates make U.S. assets more attractive, attracts a capital inflow. That causes the currency to appreciate. American producers lose competitiveness on international markets. Our exports go down, imports go up. It's a classic Mundell-Fleming in the economics textbooks, the Mundell-Fleming model. It is what happened in the early 1980s, exactly like the textbooks said. All right. And the dollar, of course, is up, especially against currencies like the peso that have reason to think that they may be the target. But the dollar is up against almost all currencies in the last 2 weeks. It had been rising over the last 2 years because of the relatively stronger expansion in the U.S. and the end of U.S. monetary easing. But if you look at the end there, since November 9th on the election, there's been an appreciation of the dollar about 5% against a broad basket of other currencies. All right.
You've got 1 minute if you.
Okay, I've got one slide, so that's a pretty good match, I guess. One of the questions we were asked to talk about precisely was how does the importance of free trade fit in, and can the U.S. continue its leadership in promoting trade? Well, I'm very much a free trader, as are most economists, and the talk about an anti-globalization talk and the possibility of violating trade agreements or just trying to turn the clock back on trade and globalization, I find quite worrisome. I think even more broadly, the world has become or had become a much better place over the last 70 years due to a trend led by the U.S. towards free trade and global institutions and other things as well, of course, democracy and so on. And it really worries me a lot, both in terms of our geopolitical position and the path of the world, and specifically the U.S. economy, that it'll reduce our productivity if we turn back the clock on globalization and so on. But let me spend my remaining half a minute saying what is likely to happen if we were indeed to sharply increase tariffs on Mexico or China or everybody, on anybody. And let's just put aside that it would violations of our international obligations, which I take very seriously. Intuitively, wouldn't an increase in import tariffs reduce imports? It just seems hard to argue with that intuitively. And it's true, it might in the short run. But even if so, we are pretty close to full employment. We are pretty, I know there are people who still don't have jobs, but there's not a whole lot of excess capacity in the economy. There's other places where there are vacancies. And so the first point to note is if we reduced imports, it would not probably increase employment and output overall, because it would just pull workers away from other sectors. Well, what about the trade balance? Would the trade balance at least improve? A fall in imports is likely to be offset by a fall in exports. And let's take Mexico. If we're importing less from them, they have fewer dollars to spend on our goods, so they're going to import less from us, just by natural economic phenomenon.
Now you really are down to 30 seconds.
Okay. Next point. A lot of what we import from Mexico and China and Canada is inputs into our automobiles and intermediate products that allow us to sell on world markets, finished automobile with high quality and at a low price. If we lose the ability to import the auto parts, for example, that are cheap, that's going to impair our ability to export autos on world market. And finally, a big one is Mexico retaliates, or whoever else we raise tariffs against retaliates. That's going to hurt our exports. Think of Smoot-Hawley, which in 1930, which we passed, and other countries retaliated, and that helped put the Great into the Great Depression. All right, my last line. The net effect of even just an increase in imports, even in the short run, depends on the other factors I talked about, national saving and all that. But I find it quite plausible that the package of policies would reduce our trade balance and rather than help it.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to get into quick commercial message. Many of you have noticed the superb timing of having this panel the day after the Italian elections. On December 15th, the day after the next Open Market Committee meeting of the Federal Reserve, we have another conference coming up on experimental monetary policy and central banks. That said, Anne.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I did know it was the day after the Italian election, but I'm not going to talk very much about that. I'll leave that to others. I want to talk about a couple of things that really weren't quite on the agenda you raised because they hadn't happened by the time you raised it. And I want to start that by saying I just came back from Australia. And the first thing to be said about it was in Canberra and stuff, and talking to people there. So almost everybody I saw was either in the government or the business community, or let's say pro-US. Okay. The interesting thing to me, or the frightening thing, was the degree to which the Australians, who ought to be in good shape because of their close ties to China, are scared and uncertain. And I would argue that one of the big problems that the Trump administration faces is whatever they're going to do, even if it's bad, they ought to do it fast, because what people are fearing has to be worse. Now, I agree with Jeff. I agree with Jeff that the first 6 months of any administration are a little bit rocky. But on the other hand, President-elect Trump has terrified people, not just frightened them, terrified them in terms of what they've done. And so many have built their economy and their trading relations on the U.S. model with open trade and open capital flows and so on. The likelihood of reversal is, I think, higher than is estimated, because it gives aid and comfort to all those who are still opposed to the opening and the liberal economic order in which we live. And I think that's above all. But then, the thing that has come up that has horrified me at least as much, if not more, than the threats for the wall and all that kind of stuff, has been the Caterpillar action last week. Carrier, sorry, wrong name company. Carrier, sorry. It shows you what jet lag will do for you. At any event, with Carrier, what he did was he intervened and talked about raising tariffs company by company, or situation by situation, which is horrifying. It's horrifying because it opens the door for more, shall we say, bribery or influence on the part of domestic companies. Once that happens, all sorts of things go wrong. The tendency to go to Washington rather than do other things is higher. I wonder what will stop companies from saying we're going to move abroad unless we get such and so. And once that opens the Pandora's box, closing it is incredibly difficult. Most of the developing countries engaged, past tense, in such policies and learned their lesson. Now we're talking about the United States entering into this most horrifying thing. There's actually an example closer to home, which is Puerto Rico, where, given the tax exemptions given by the federal government, the state authorities then basically negotiated tax rates individually with individual companies to come to them, which is the flip side of not going away. And in so doing, managed to get the average corporate tax rate effectively down from 30% to 4%. With no checks or looking at what the effects were, when the Clinton administration which, by the way, obviously encouraged capital-intensive industries, which is not what Puerto Rico needed. But then when the Clinton administration decided to take them away, the Puerto Ricans concluded that they were in recession because of that, rather than recognizing that their fundamental decline was due to other factors. I'm frightened that the Carrier result will indeed be the same kind of thing, or opening the door to the same kind of thing here. It is really horrifying, and even worse than raising tariffs. And I'm certainly, as Jeff and everybody on this panel know, I'm against that. But doing this would be even worse. If he does retaliate, as he has threatened, by raising the tariffs on inputs of the companies which have gone overseas, he is cutting down, of course, exports, as Jeff said, and I agree with everything he said. I would add one thing, and only one thing, on China, and that is that were they to go to a flexible exchange rate, not only would there be pressure to depreciate because of that, but the capital outflow would intensify it. And there's obvious evidence of that, as they are putting on capital controls to try and contain it. So we would have a double whammy on the Chinese side to make things worse, in addition to the things that Jeff already said. The Caterpillar, I will do it again. The Carrier intervention is frightening for all kinds of reasons. As I said, the threat, how you would then get into officials deciding individually which companies will get how much or reward in this reduced taxes or something else for doing it, or penalty for not doing it, which again would be somewhat ad hoc. If companies individually are subject to higher tariffs, but not their competitors in the United States, what will that do to our system? I think, spend the rest of my time just on that one. I think it is not only bad international economic policy, it is bad domestic policy of the worst possible kind. And as I said, we have countries like India who have engaged in it for years, and they found out what was wrong. Do we have to rediscover the wheel and discover that you don't run an economy on that kind of an ad hoc decision basis, I think it is really horrifying. In addition to that, that takes me to my second topic, and that is the WTO. The WTO is obviously, in any event, in some degree of difficulty because of the failure of the Doha round. That said, it is possible to conceive of another round taking up new issues, value-added chains and things like this, and beginning to restore the system or strengthen the system further, say it whichever way you will. President-elect Trump has, of course, threatened to violate all kinds of things, but even the carrier decision in itself would violate them. If he then imposes tariffs because a company does elect to go overseas anyway, whether they're activity specific or they're just item specific, it would violate WTO agreements, which we have made. Almost all U.S. tariffs are bound to 99% of the total imports, or maybe even 100%, but certainly over 99. To break that unilaterally is difficult, and of course he can withdraw from agreements, but that is disastrous for a number of reasons. Even if Doha failed, the dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO is by all accounts working well. It could be better, it could be faster, there are other things, but there has been general satisfaction throughout the world with it. Losing that would be horribly important. So I think the value of the WTO, not only as a place where disputes could be resolved, but we could go further toward an open multilateral system, has already been partially weakened by regional arrangements and so on. But doing something like this would go to the heart of the issue of what is an open multilateral system, and I think would really undercut much of what we have done, we the United States as leaders since 1945, and I happen to think that what we did was in the best interest of our country and the world. And if we do that, the likelihood of a trade war is very high. You can't impose tariffs and do all these kinds of things and not have retaliation. We're too important. If there's retaliation, we're talking about going back to a regime of much slower growth, if not worse. And we're talking about all kinds of consequences, both political and economic, from that, which I view as nothing short of disastrous. But let me continue, because there's more. Clearly on the IMF, I think there's much that can be done. I think the IMF needs to be shored up in all kinds of ways. The precedent set by the junior partnership in the Greek rescue is, I think, an unfortunate one for a whole variety of reasons. In the time when we're looking at economic difficulties throughout much of the world, it's important that the IMF do what it does best, which is to be able to assess the core macroeconomic policies in a country and figure out what the prospects going forward are. The U.S. has seen its self-interest in any number of IMF programs in crisis countries. To lose that and have to do it by itself would already make it more difficult, both politically and economically. It's hard enough to get the IMF going into a country in grave economic difficulties. Having the Secretary of the Treasury go in and try and negotiate the same, or his deputies go in and negotiate the same package, I think would not only be more costly for the United States, but even worse in two ways. One, I don't think they have the competence yet to do it quite to the same extent. And two, even if they did, the cost would be greater because you wouldn't have the participation of other countries in it, which then makes the political actions in the country in question more difficult. It's difficult enough with the IMF, even more difficult otherwise. So I would argue that in that one, the priority for the Trump administration, even in its own self-interest and perspective, ought to be to strengthen the hand, not weaken it. Now, there's lots more. The loss of leadership strikes me as disastrous in any number of regards. And I'm not worrying simply about the Chinese taking the leadership. I'm worrying about countries basically reverting to the nationalistic protectionist policies that have been removed with such great effect all over the place. So I don't think you can basically count that out if Mr. Trump goes ahead the way he's going. The world is going to face a tough international economic situation, even if we do think the United States does everything as best it can. We have the euro in difficulty, and that includes not only Greece, but we don't know what will happen to Italy after today. There are some other countries in the euro area that also are showing signs of strain. Whether the euro can hold in these circumstances, I think, is a question, not to mention Brexit. We have the question as to what will happen there. And that's Europe, which historically, since 1945, has been one of the more reliable parts of the world. I won't even bother to remind you of the Middle East, because that's not necessary. Africa's gone through a much slower growth period, based largely on the falling commodity prices, but that's because its growth was based largely on the increase in commodity prices, so that's not going anywhere till the rest of the world does better, at least as far as we can see. Turning to Asia, Japan looks as if it's picking up again, but South Korea looks as if it may be in such political difficulty that it will spill over. And those are the two strongest economies other than China. We know that China has difficulties on the economic front. We're worrying about the growth rate. We're worrying about what they do on the exchange rate, et cetera, et cetera. India's growth rate is supposed to be very good, and may be, although the statistics are subject to more question than most, as they rebased in ways that no Indian economist I know can explain to me. And I know a lot of them. So, I mean, the Indian figures are subject at least to some question in that regard. Obviously, the current currency exchange is going to make current things at this point even less favorable than they were, probably by at least 1% and maybe 2% of GDP for the rest of this fiscal year. So India looks less promising than might be, and there are some protectionist, what should I say, hints behind Prime Minister Modi's Make in India campaign. It does not sound as if it's a we're going to export campaign. It sounds more like we're going to make sure it's domestic at all costs. So Asia, the large economies do not look all that good. Japan looks a little bit better than it did. Indonesia is questionable. So where are we? We then have almost nothing left. Russia, no, that's not going anywhere right now. Latin America, Brazil certainly does not look favorable in the short run, and maybe a couple of other countries aren't too badly off. Mexico is impacted by what we do. So if you look around the world, the United States and maybe a few other countries show some signs of economic strength, but that's all. In that circumstance, I would argue that we have the near full employment, as Jeff said, some early signs of possible increases in inflationary pressure. The appropriate stance, it seems to me, for the new administration would be to worry about international economic policy in terms of trying to stabilize the international situation, which would start by underpinning and reinforcing the roles of the international institutions, the rules of the WTO, getting measures other than protection and other than nationalism in place on the international economic front. So let me end by then asking what Alex started with, will we have crash or gradual descent? My own bet is that if the Trump administration follows the policies that we fear, it will not be a crash. I wish it would be, because then we'd learn quickly. I fear more it will be a slow descent. It will be, as has happened in countries that tried these policies earlier. Their growth rates aren't quite what they'd like, so they do more of it. We encourage more companies not to go overseas. And then we descend further into it. So my fear would be disintegration to some extent of the international economy and slowing, if not stagnant, economy domestically. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ann. Fred?
I agree with virtually everything that both Jeff and Ann said, so I'll try to make things interesting by adding 3 or 4 points. The first is to reverse the title of the session. The session's title is Challenges Facing the Trump Administration. But I want to reverse it and talk about the challenges that the Trump administration is posing for the rest of the world. Because as Ann said in discussing leadership, I think that's the overarching and most important issue. As Ann and Jeff both said, the United States has led the world toward an open international economic order for over 70 years. That's been on the whole very successful, both for the world and for us. If the U.S. backs away, there is a huge question as to what follows. Worse, of course, as Ann said, if we reverse course and actually adopt protectionist measures that encourage other countries to reverse their courses of the last 70 years. But even if we simply abdicated our leadership and stood back and were inert and let the world sort of fend for itself, the risks would be huge. The famous MIT economist Charlie Kindleberger, in fact, interpreted the 1930s as resulting from just such a phenomenon. His argument was that the demise of global economic leadership, creating a vacuum, was what permitted the currency wars and trade wars of the 1930s, and as Jeff said, made the Depression great. That happened because the previous leader, the United Kingdom, was no longer able to lead, having been ravaged by a war and a deep recession and its general demise as a country. But the natural follow-on leader, the United States, was not yet ready to do so, and in fact made the situation worse with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the big devaluation of '33, etc. And so the world was left in a vacuum. There was no leadership. There was nobody to provide global public goods. Open markets, a global currency, capital flows, the kinds of things that are necessary to facilitate global commerce, global finance, and keep the world economy running successfully. So the question today is whether a retreat, let alone a reversal, by a new U.S. administration would create a similar vacuum that could have somewhat similar results. If the United States was no longer able, in its own view, or willing to lead, and the natural next leader, China, by their own token admission, by their own administration, not yet ready to do so clearly, then a vacuum would result. And even though we now have institutions, which they did not have in the 1930s, and that is a huge difference, the question is whether those institutions would function and be able to fill the gap and play the needed role if the putative national leaders of those institutions were, by hypothesis, copping out. So I think that's big overarching question number one. Virtually everything, in fact, flows from that. And so as we counsel the new administration, counsel the Congress, which may interestingly provide a backlash against the administration in this case, very interesting, the two key committee chairmen, the chairman of House Ways and Means, the chairman of Senate Finance, have already said, well, now wait a minute, do we really want to back out of TPP? Maybe we want to stay involved in Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So in a role reversal from the historical pattern, it may be the Congress which kind of stands up for the right and good, while the administration is going down the wrong track. That's to watch, but the basic issue, will there be a leadership vacuum? Will the global economy fail to have the kind of leadership necessary? Will it, if that happens, lead to anything like the pact in the 1930s? Question number two, what does Trump really want with his foreign economic policy? As Jeff said, we don't really know. I doubt that he knows in any kind of detail. But if you try to discern what his various pronouncements portend, it seems to be a reduction, or maybe elimination, or maybe reversal of the U.S. trade deficit. Talk about currency manipulation in China, which, as Jeff said, is at least 2 years out of date. You talk about getting barriers down with countries where we have big bilateral deficits, China and Mexico. If you try to put together the various things Trump said in the campaign, and he and his people have said since, you have to infer that they really want to get rid of the trade deficit and view that as kind of a proxy for everything that's unfair, no good, and to be reversed in the new administration. Now, as Jeff said, and I agreed with his full analysis there, Trump's policies are almost certain to make the trade deficit worse. Trade deficit's already going to get worse because the dollar exchange rate has risen a lot over the last 2 years. The lags are 2 to 3 years from exchange rate change to trade balance change. So already the trade deficit that Jeff showed, right at the end, you could see it starting to get a little worse again. It'll get considerably worse over the next 2 or 3 years in any event. But then comes the fiscal expansion, the monetary tightening, and a repeat of the Reagan-Volcker policy mix of the early 1980s. So with the deficit going up and his objective being to get it down, what are the implications? What might he do? Well, again, as Jeff said, trade protection won't help. If anything, that'll make it worse, at least over time. And even in the short run, you don't get much from trade protection in terms of improving your trade balance if you get anything. You're driven to the exchange rate. You're driven back to the exchange rate as the potential policy tool to deal with a situation of this type. Well, when the Reagan-Volcker policy mix occurred in the first half of the 1980s, The Reagan administration, in its second manifestation, realized that was terrible, was leading to a huge protectionist surge in the Congress, and under Jim Baker's leadership, reversed course and called the Plaza Agreement. So an immediate question for Trump would be, paradoxically, suggesting he needs to think at least about a little international financial cooperation, Plaza 2. Is it time for a Plaza 2? Jeff and I have debated that recently in putting a book together. Well, the problem is that the other countries are not in very good shape to participate in a Plaza 2. As Ann said, their economies are weak. They're not really very inclined to go for a strengthening of their currencies to enable a weaker dollar in order to correct the global imbalances. To the contrary, probably, most of them, Japan certainly, the Europeans even to some extent, want to see their currencies weaken, not strengthen, and they're quite happy with the dollar strengthening that's gone on the last 2 years and has accelerated since Trump's election. So if that's the case, and if we hypothesize that the Trump administration is inclined to mean what it says and go unilateral where necessary, what might it do? Well, one thing it could do, and it's talked about this, is put in a value-added tax as a substitute for U.S. direct taxes and rebate at the border. One of Trump's complaints about Mexico, and to a lesser extent China, has been that they have value-added taxes, that they rebate on exports, charge on imports, that operates like an export subsidy and an import surcharge. We don't have that. The problem, of course, is that we're the only country that doesn't have that. The whole rest of the world has that. The WTO sanctions it and approves it, so we would actually have to adopt that system ourselves to be able to counter fighting fire with fire. But we could do it. And Trump, in his tax reform proposals, has actually put forward a variant of a value-added tax. Not quite sure his variant meets the WTO tests, but in broad terms, it is a substitute of an indirect U.S. tax for the existing direct taxes, which would be rebatable at the border, and if they were 15-20%, would amount over time to a de facto 15 to 20% devaluation. So he could do that. If they don't do that, or that got retaliated against because it turns out not to be consistent with WTO, what else could they do? Well, of course, they could intervene unilaterally in the currency markets to drive the dollar down. Now, I happen to have promoted the idea of what I call countervailing currency intervention. Back in the bad old days when China and others were manipulating a lot, I advocated the U.S. countering their intervention with intervention of our own. If China buys $1 billion of dollars to keep the dollar overvalued, we should buy $1 billion of renminbi to neutralize the impact. That would, of course, deter them from doing it in the future because they would gain nothing and the practice would be countered. I still think we should put those policies into place to deter a return to currency manipulation. But just to be clear, I, the currency manipulation hawk, say with Jeff and Ed, there's no manipulation by China or anybody else major at this time. It would be a deterrent for the future. But you could imagine that a Trump administration, if it wanted to be really aggressive on this stuff, could intervene directly in the currency market to drive the dollar down, even though the foreign compatriots disagreed with that policy, or at least were not willing to go along with a Plaza 2 type cooperative agreement to manage it cooperatively. And that, of course, would then trigger a currency war, because the other countries would undoubtedly respond with my kind of countervailing currency intervention against the United States, rather than, as I had advocated, the United States doing it vis-a-vis China back when they were manipulating so aggressively. So a second risk, which would obviously exacerbate my first risk and make it much more tangible, much more specific, would be a resort to currency manipulation by the Trump administration in order to weaken the dollar, to try to improve the U.S. trade balance in that way. Again, it would almost certainly fail because of retaliation, in that case through the currency markets and maybe through trade as well, which is what happened in the 1930s. Some of the trade retaliation was against currency depreciations of that period. So you could replay that very nasty drama once again in very specific ways. So that would be risk number 2 that I would put on the table, a more specific variant of risk number 1, but something that would make it much worse. Third, and much more briefly, Asia and the TPP. As I already said, Trump is already getting backlash against his backlash from an unsuspected source, the congressional leadership, which had been exhibiting great reluctance to pass the TPP, but all of a sudden, hearing that the new president is going to withdraw from the TPP, says, well, now wait a minute, not so fast. Asia's pretty important, and those are big markets, and those are fast-growing countries, and we don't want to be discriminated against because we know that they're going to keep doing deals with or without us. And that's, of course, the crucial point. You even saw it at the APEC summit in Lima within 2 weeks of Trump's election, where the other TPP countries are even talking about going ahead with the TPP without the United States. They'd have to rejigger and do a little revising, but they could easily do it. They're certainly going to go ahead with the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, much weaker in form than TPP, but it'll still create some discrimination against non-members like the United States. China sitting back and holding out the basket and letting all this US stupidity flow into it is simply saying charmingly, well, let's go ahead with the free trade area of the Asia Pacific that we've been studying for a couple of years anyway, and they'll certainly get resonance. And Anne's friends in Australia, I'm sure she picked it up when she was there, are already talking about that. Terrified of Trump's terrifying, they will perhaps move with their other trade partners, of which China is by far the biggest, to go down the road toward new trade agreements without the United States that discriminate against us. So I simply want to remind everybody that Hatch and Brady are right and Trump is wrong to withdraw the United States from active trade integration with Asia. Remember that when President Obama came into office, he had no interest in trade policy. He didn't want to do anything on trade. He wanted trade to leave him alone for 4, if not 8 years. What happened, very explicitly, was that Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore and the greatest strategy of Asia Pacific in history, said to him back in late 2009, President Obama, if you don't take economic initiatives toward Asia, you're going to turn the region over to the Chinese. And Lee Kuan Yew said it in just so many words. And President Obama got the message. And 3 weeks later, made a speech in Tokyo, said, we're back in the TPP. And from there, it took off. So geopolitical considerations alone argue for keeping the U.S. engaged in Asia. But the economics of it add to the case because otherwise the discrimination, the adverse effect in the world's largest market, fastest growing market, most dynamic economy would be terrible for the United States. Fourth and final point, and just to make it very briefly, because this conference is not about internal reactions to the globalization backlash and all that, but I think it must be said that underlying the backlash that led to the election outcomes, and remember, President candidate Clinton was against TPP as well. She defended globalization more broadly, but was against TPP. Bernie Sanders was more against. So it wasn't just Trump, although he was the most extreme version. So there's reality there. There's fire beneath the smoke. So changes are needed. Changes certainly in the way we economists, but the bully pulpit of the White House, the administration, the Congress, educate our public about the gains and losses from trade and the fact that the net gains are so large. We did a study at Peterson Institute 10 years ago, showed the U.S. is $1 trillion a year richer, on balance, from the globalization of the previous half century. Those numbers are now even much bigger. That number hides some gross losses. We quantified 50 billion a year or so. We know there are costs, losers, and downsides from globalization. And we have to admit that the United States has done a terrible job of dealing with those costs, downsides, and losers. We have not provided effective safety nets to help them adjust. We have not provided effective adjustment programs, labor and retraining programs, lifetime education programs that are necessary to move to respond to any dynamic economic change, away from the status quo to something that's better for the community as a whole, but hurts individuals. So there are a lot of things that have to be done to refashion the foundation for an open international economic policy. But the costs, if we fail to do that, are enormous, and I hope very, very profoundly we will not go down that path.
Thank you. Greg,
Remind me, Alex, how many minutes do I have?
you have 14 before you hear from me.
Okay, got it. All right. Okay. So rather than give the Trump administration advice, which, as Jeff points out, he probably wouldn't take anyway, I'll try and analyze exactly what Trump's worldview is and how that's likely to affect the United States and the world economy. So last week he had a bit of a victory tour. We went to Indianapolis after successfully browbeating Carrier into keeping a plant open there. He gave a talk where, after he got through the usual nostrums about making America great, he had a couple lines that actually, if you listen carefully, are very sort of crystallized the way he sees the world. He said, there is no global anthem, no global currency, no certificate of global citizenship. You're not going to get anywhere understanding Trump if you try to place him on the usual spectrum of big government versus small government or left versus right. The new spectrum, and this is present in Europe as well, is nationalist versus globalist, and Trump is firmly in the nationalist camp, as Theresa May is in the UK, Marine Le Pen is in France, and the Five Star Movement, which successfully defeated the referendum on constitutional reform in Italy yesterday, is. Trump's nationalism, in fact, most nationalism, is not fundamentally an economic ideology, because economics at root is that markets exist to facilitate trade, and trade is mutually advantageous. But Trump comes from the world of New York real estate, and in New York real estate, every transaction yields a winner and a loser. There's only so much real estate in Manhattan, and if I get it, somebody else doesn't get it. Trump sees the world economy the same way. If someone else is winning, the United States must be losing. This isn't new. In fact, it harkens back to the mercantilist philosophy of the world that prevailed up until about a century ago and certainly dominated national policy before World War II. Fred, you talked about Smoot-Hawley sort of initiating the end of globalism and the Great Depression in the 1930s. I would actually go back a little earlier. I would say Trump is close. I would call Trump a Warren Harding Republican, because Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge have succeeded him in congressional allies like John Cabot Lodge, where they were nativists, they were isolationists. One of Harding's first acts as president was to dramatically raise tariffs. He then later signed the most restrictionist immigration bill in American history. And he did not, and Republicans at the time did not fundamentally believe that the United States had any hegemonic responsibility to the world economy. And it was the policies pursued by the United States in the 1920s that led to the collapse of the global financial system that Charles Kindleberger wrote about. Today, though, the intellectual center of the Republican Party is not Warren Harding Republicanism. I would call it Jack Kemp Republicanism. Jack Kemp Republicans believe in supply-side economics, that growth is the most important thing of all. Lower taxes and lower tariffs are good for growth, and they don't really care about trade deficits. Trump's emerging cabinet, and in fact his own worldview, is kind of this amalgam of Warren Harding and Jack Kemp Republicanism. The problem here is there's a gigantic contradiction between Harding Republicanism and Kemp Republicanism, and both Jeff and Fred have referred to this. Harding nationalists care a lot about the trade deficit. Kemp supply-siders don't. Trump wants a huge tax cut and infrastructure program that would together expand the budget deficit on the order of 1 to 2 percentage points a year of GDP. But he's also fixated on the trade deficit and wants policies such as the Carrier deal that will close it. But these ideas are working at cross purposes. So if he pursues the tax and spending policies that he's promised, we're going to get a big stimulus. The Fed will normalize rates more quickly. The dollar will appreciate, and that will cause the trade deficit to widen. And this will be especially the case because of the unique situation the world is in right now, where the Eurozone and Japan have interest rates stuck at zero and inflation that is too low. So rather than in a normal situation where they would be inclined to follow the Fed with higher interest rates, they will keep interest rates where they are, and they will welcome the weaker currency that results, and this will actually tend to aggravate the expansion of the trade deficit. Now, I actually studied this, wrote about this in a column, and I actually went to Macroeconomic Advisors, which is a very good consulting firm, to simulate, to run an econometric simulation of what would happen. And they took a $4 trillion tax cut by Trump, and they found that the trade deficit in this scenario eventually rises to $1 trillion a year in year 10. That's approximately 25% larger than in the baseline scenario. This is not, by the way, how Trump's advisors see it. They have a very mercantilist view of trade. They say if we can eliminate a 2.5% of GDP trade deficit, we can expand GDP by 2.5%. That's not how standard macroeconomists like Jeff and Fred think about it, okay? Basically, the way economists think about it is that you expand GDP if you have spare capital and labor that can add to GDP. If you're already at full employment, that spare capital and labor is not lying around. Therefore, this won't work. So Trump is going to find out that if he tries to pursue both these goals, something's going to have to give. So he's going to find probably the trade deficit will get worse, and to the extent that the trade deficit is his benchmark of success, he's going to want to do something about it, and that will lead to more protectionist pressure. It was pointed out that since he's been elected, Mexico's peso has fallen 10% against the dollar. It's now 10% cheaper to manufacture in Mexico than it was the day before Trump was elected. And that will be a much more powerful magnet to outsourcing to Mexico than anything that he can do with the telephone or the carrot and the stick, as he did last week. I was going to talk a little bit about China, but I think Jeff did a very good job on that. So I'll simply say that if Trump wants China to guide the yuan higher, I'm not really sure how they're supposed to do that when they're already losing hundreds of billion dollars a month in reserves, trying to keep it from going lower. But even if they were, I just don't see how they can get it high enough to actually move the needle on the trade deficit. So since shakedowns of Carrier and the like, they're certainly going to rattle corporate boardrooms and probably prompt some rethinking about how they do things. But as Ann said, my greater concern is that it just leads to more crony capitalism without actually moving the needle on the trade deficit. What would move the needle on the trade deficit? Well, a weaker dollar would, but that would, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, require much easier monetary policy than Janet Yellen and company seem inclined to pursue. And indeed, if you were to listen to the more hawkish monetary policy advisors around Trump, they would prefer more hawkish people on the Federal Reserve Board, which would result in faster normalization and an even stronger dollar. But let's say that Trump's weak dollar preferences prevail in the arena of monetary policy. We might expect the Trump administration to put explicit pressure on the Fed to raise interest rates. And since basically the 90s, we've gotten sort of lulled into this idea that presidents don't interfere with monetary policy. But that's really kind of, only a recent phenomenon.
Not to raise interest rates.
Well, so did I say to raise
interest rates?
You said to raise it. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I stand corrected. So let's say he puts pressure on the Fed not to raise interest rates. Well, LBJ did it, Nixon did it, Reagan in the second term did it. So there's no reason to suspect that Trump would sort of see any reason why he shouldn't do it. Either Yellen gives in, which I actually kind of doubt, or she's replaced by somebody who's more pliant. What if he decides to actually follow the example of Obama and Bush and Clinton and keep his hands off monetary policy? So the only remaining option is higher tariffs. Now, we've talked about how we can do this, and like Ann, actually, I would prefer higher tariffs than the sort of bespoke phone and pen deals, which, as Ann I think correctly pointed out, probably won't work and are just going to open the door to all sorts of crony capitalism. But that said, if he does impose unilateral tariffs, this is likely to be found illegal under the WTO. And it comes at a time when protectionist actions are already on the upswing. Global Trade Alert in Geneva has tracked the incidences of global protectionist actions, and they've been rising steadily since 2008. So it'd be hugely disruptive, and if we can assume that it would at least be partly reciprocated by our trading partners, so you'd see a very significant rise in protectionism. I don't think this would be a major macroeconomic event. I think it would be, however, much more negative to productivity. It would be negative to confidence and so forth. And it would come, I think, partly because it speaks to the body language of the Trump administration. A nationalist administration versus a globalist administration is one, as I was saying, that does not feel a great responsibility for the hegemonic responsibilities of the United States. So you might have said that that a Trump administration might have been indifferent to whether the European Union and the Eurozone stay together or fall apart. What's remarkable is that actually Trump is not indifferent. He actually was cheering on Brexit. And I suspect that since he and Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders of the Netherlands, another Eurosceptic, all share a similar sort of nationalist philosophy, that the European anti-Euro populists now see, if not explicit, an implicit supporter in the White House. Now, does that make a difference? I'm not sure. Ultimately, the populist, the voters of Europe will make their decision based on their own view of what they want for their own country. But I think at the margin it does make a difference. I do believe that populism is contagious for two reasons. First of all, the establishment basically painted all these horror stories about what would happen if Britain voted to leave the European Union. The pound would crash, the stock market would crash, a horrible recession would begin immediately. And I'm not exaggerating, they did say that it would begin immediately. It would not begin when Parliament invoked Article 50. It would begin immediately. None of that happened. All right, the stock market took off because now the sterling was cheaper, and this is very good for short-term economic growth. Similarly, a lot of folks, myself included, thought that the stock market would decline a lot if Trump won the election. It's gone up. We can debate for many reasons why that would happen, but I think the point is that anybody who tries to tell the voters of Europe that voting for a populist party that will take them out of the European Union or the euro has a serious credibility problem. So I think as populists win, it starts to inoculate voters against the fear, that their standard of living will suffer if they actually cast a vote against the establishment. And I think, again, the other thing is that, like Barack Obama, ineffectually argued in favor of Britain staying inside the European Union because he said that if they wanted a trade agreement, they would have to go, with the United States, they'd have to go back to the back of the queue. I think a Trump administration would be inclined to put Britain at the front of the queue, actually. And I think that he is possibly likely to extend that same sort of treatment to other nationalist movements because they are similarly aligned against what they see as a damaging, self-interested globalist elite. So I do see the ingredients in place for the United States under this administration to, by withdrawing from its traditional hegemonic role, to feed some of the pre-existing centrifugal forces that are underway in the global economy now. I don't right now see that as developing into a crisis in the next 12 months. I actually think the euro is likely to survive the coming year. But the euro is such a flawed mechanism to start with that only by creating more economic integration could its contradictions be eliminated and it survive. With the populists now basically at the door of every of every capital city in Western Europe, it's highly unlikely that the sorts of things that would generate that greater integration are going to be politically possible. So although I don't expect the euro to fall apart in the coming year, I think that its lifespan might be limited in the coming decade. As for the United States economy, I'm sort of like in Ann Krieger's camp. I don't expect it to die with a bang, but more of a whimper. That we have put in so much regulation since the financial crisis that you simply cannot get, I think, the degrees of leverage and capital flows that generate gigantic discontinuities in economic activity. But the various forces I see coming together are those that I think are going to chip away at long-term growth, not add to it.
Thank you, Greg. At the beginning, I said, well, we knew there'd be a dark view, but was anybody going to take the bright view? Well, now we're all the way through the panel down to Desmond, so we know we're not going to get the bright view. But we'll get a great summary, I'm sure. And Desmond, thanks again for our partnership in putting this together.
I hate to disappoint you once again. You're certainly not going to get the bright view from me. In fact, I think that our panelists have been somewhat too optimistic. I say that in jest, but I'm quite serious about it because I think that what they haven't focused on and which I want to focus on are two real things. One are the financial situation of the global economy right now and the many fault lines in that economy. I obviously agree with a lot of what my previous speakers have said, but I don't think that they're paying sufficient attention to that. And more troubling, I don't think Donald Trump is paying attention to that. And my fear is that the kind of policies that he is proposing are really going to cause real financial stress in the globe and could lead us to another meltdown that we experienced in 2008, 2009. The policies that really bother me about Trump, and I think that there is more clarity than Jeff gives credit to, is that he's embarking on a massive fiscal stimulus at a time that the United States economy is very close to full employment. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to cut corporate taxes, household taxes, big scale, increase infrastructure spending, increase defense spending. So this is going to do very much what Jeff said. It's going to, and we're seeing it already in the markets, it's going to put pressure on US interest rates, it's going to cause the dollar to appreciate, and that is the last thing that the global economy really needs right now. The second thing, of course, is on the trade side, tearing up trade agreements or posing tariffs or threatening to do this, that, and the other hardly creates an environment of certainty and confidence for a weak global economy. Now, the reason that I think that we're in serious trouble, certainly during the course of his administration, and I would expect it to be during the first or second year, is that we've got a remarkable combination of factors in the global economy that can produce a perfect storm. And I'd suggest that there are four items that are of concern to me. The first is that the global economy is drowning in debt. The second is that credit risk is badly mispriced around a whole range of markets, whether it's high yield market, emerging markets, European debt market, we've got that problem. Third, we've got serious problems in a whole bunch of systemic banks, particularly in Europe. And fourth, there are plenty of fault lines in major economies that I'll talk about in a moment. So let me go through each of those points. But before that, let me just suggest that at the heart of the problem is this chart, which reflects what has happened to central bank balance sheets between something like 2008, 2016. We all know that the Federal Reserve took 100 years to get its balance sheet from 0 to 800 billion, but it only took something like 6 years to go from 800 billion to $4.5 trillion. That experience has been repeated by other central banks across the globe. So we've got the Bank of Japan, the ECB, the Bank of England, Bank of China. Long story short is that the balance sheets of these banks have increased from $6 trillion to $16 trillion over the last 8 years. What that has done is it's led to an enormous overhang of debt, which you see in the IMF's chart. This chart is showing you that before 2008, global debt was something like 200% of GDP. Today, we're talking about global debt being something like 225% of GDP. What worries me is that that debt increase has been unevenly distributed, and there are countries where we've got far higher increases in debt that makes them very vulnerable. The country that really excels in this process is China, where we've had a credit bubble. You can see that on the far left line. The credit bubble in China makes that in the United States preceding the housing bubble, or that in Japan before its last decade, look very pale. This is a far sharper increase. 90% of GDP increase in credit is going to be producing problems. I'm not necessarily saying that the Chinese economy is going to bust like that of the United States, but it's certainly going to slow like that of Japan, which will cause a lot of problems for its trade partners. European debt keeps rising. That we have the crisis starting in 2010. They go for fiscal tightening. It's supposed to bring the debt levels down, but we see that places like Italy got a public debt to GDP ratio of 133%, Portugal a similar amount. So we've got a problem in Europe. Emerging markets. The BIS doesn't tire of reminding us that the emerging market corporates have gone on a borrowing binge, the likes of which we haven't seen before. What they've done is they've run up their debt, they've more than doubled their debt, but what is scary is that they've increased their borrowing in dollars by $3.5 trillion. So if we get dollar rising, we've got real problem for emerging markets countries like Brazil, Turkey, and so on, that these countries are systemically important. So that's the first point I'd make, is that you've just got far too much debt. You've got these debt bubbles. They're going to have consequences. And if this occurs together, they can set one another off. We can really have a problem. The second problem, which I think is even worse than the first of having a lot of debt, is we've got the debt really badly mispriced. And I just mention two things. One is we've really had a global bond bubble, and you can see it in this chart, which shows, until the recent sell-off, that of sovereign bonds, fully a quarter of these bonds are bearing interest rates that are negative. Now, that doesn't make much sense when you've got all of the central banks around the globe got an inflation target of 2%. They're paying negative interest rates. They're assuring you losses if you hold to maturity in real terms. What is more concerning to me is the fact that the credit spreads between different countries have now all converged. So just to give you one example, a country which has got as many problems as Italy manages to borrow at a lower interest rate than that of the United States. That really doesn't make much sense. When that gets corrected, we're really going to have real stresses in the financial system. And I could mention, a country like Saudi Arabia running a budget deficit of 15% of GDP has no problem raising $17.5 billion in one issue at very favorable interest rates. So that's the second point on the credit risk. The third point is systemic weakness in banks. I won't go on about that too much, other than to say that if you look at the Italian banking system, their non-performing loans amount to 18% of the bank's balance sheet. On top of that, the banks are holding 10% of their balance sheet. They're holding Italian sovereign bonds, which aren't really going to be repaid in the end. So you've really got huge problems in the Italian banking system. And then, which actually I quite enjoy the fact that the Germans, who keep preaching to the Italians and the rest of Southern Europe how bad their banking system is, have got serious problems with Deutsche Bank and their other major banks. So what I'm saying is that if you've got already problems in the banks, and now you're going to get repricing on the credit, or you're going to get defaults on the credit, you've got problem in your banking system, and that generally is an ingredient of having a global financial crisis. Let me just close by saying a few words on the fault lines in the global economy. These fault lines are in important countries, systemically important countries. I would start, Italy is very high on my list of those countries. This is the third largest country in the Eurozone. It's the country that's got the third largest sovereign bond market, a mere $2.5 trillion. Its banking system's got $4 trillion. We're talking about a serious economy that's got serious problems. You've got problems that Europe has got a whole lot of elections this year that are going to make it very difficult to deal with the stresses as they arise. I've mentioned the Chinese economy is slowing. The Japanese economy is on a path to a train wreck, but that might be further down the road, and emerging markets have got stresses. I'll just close by saying a word about Italy. Given the referendum last night, and it always amazes me that you have a big political event like this and the market just yawns. It doesn't really understand how seriously compromised Italy is, that you've got an economy that is totally sclerotic. It hasn't grown. It's something like 8% below where it was in 2008, that it's got a banking system that I've mentioned drowning in non-performing loans, that its Treasury has got far too much debt, and they've managed to lose something like 15% of competitiveness against Germany. So in short, I think one's really got to be highly optimistic to think that the global economy is not going to be a problem for Donald Trump, during his 4 years in office. and the way in which he is going about his business is he's going to accelerate the process at which this comes unstuck. Otherwise, I feel good about the global economy.
Thank you, Desmond, very much, and thanks to the panelists for a series of really interesting comments. I want to go back down the panel again and give each speaker a chance to add or discuss what somebody else has said or make more predictions. I don't think I only got one or two real predictions. As short as you want, but maximum 3 minutes each, and Jeff, we'll let you start again.
Okay, so there was a lot of agreement on the panel. I'm quite conscious that by virtue of the privilege of going first, I preempted a lot of what the others were going to say. Let me just talk a little bit more about the implications of a strong dollar. One way of summarizing what I said before, and which the others I think agreed with, is that Mr. Trump is doing more to depreciate other currencies against the dollar than all the currency manipulation in the world is doing. But the dollar, admittedly, had already been on a path of appreciation due to fundamentals previously. We talked about the implications for the U.S. trade balance. Let me just say a word about the flip side. What are the implications for the rest of the world? Won't this depreciation of all these other currencies, both emerging markets and the euro and so on, help the other countries? Yes, in some sense, and on the trade side, it maybe is what the world needs, and the dollar appreciation is reflecting the fact that the U.S. economy is been quite strong compared to other economies. But on the list of crises, list of possible shocks, which is kind of where Desmond was leaving us, let me flag one, which is that appreciation of the dollar against all these other currencies is causing problems, severe problems for developing countries and others that export commodities. The price of commodities, oil and others, are down a lot in the last 2 years, but especially in terms of dollars. And this is especially a problem for those countries that have borrowed in terms of dollars. They're the ones that are under very severe pressure. So if you've got dollar-denominated debt and you're exporting commodities that are going down in terms of dollars, you're really in trouble. This was kind of repeats it's happened sometimes before in the early 1980s, and the international debt crisis. After the 90s, a lot of emerging market countries learned some lessons and decreased their dollar debt and learned to borrow in their domestic currencies, and foreign investors allowed themselves to be exposed to that. And that's part of the reason why the emerging market countries came through the global financial crisis in better shape than some of the advanced countries and then in the past. But there's been some backtracking, particularly on corporate debt denominated in dollars in many of these currencies, and that's a possible flashpoint for a coming crisis.
Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of, actually, to add to things, because I too agree with most everything. First, there is a proposal to lower corporate profit tax rates, which I think I agree with. You can do it revenue neutral by removing corporate deductions, and the only question is how many deductions you remove at the same time to give you broad-based. The American Action Forum has come up with a plan which could reduce it to 20% revenue neutral, but it doesn't include partially raising a carbon tax, which most of us think would be a good thing anyway. So that in a sense you can do that part of the tax thing, which would be good for U.S. trade balance, current account balance, and it would be good for resource allocation domestically. So there's one part, at least, of the tax proposal. I'm not at all sure that's what Trump is, but on the other hand, there's one part that does make sense, and the revenue neutrality is important there. You could do a little bit on the same regard with personal income taxes if you, again, could reduce enough deductions. But from what I've seen of the estimates, and I don't make any myself, you could not do enough to get as much lowering of the tax rate as is envisaged at all, and it would have to hit highly on removing things where it is the one top 10% at least that take the tax deductions, which would have to be removed. You cannot remove charitable deductions, I guess, politically. Mortgage deductions, I think you could start by capping, but you can't take them out immediately, and so on and so forth. So how much you can get on the personal income tax side is a question. I certainly agree that TPP is important. I think it's important economically, but I think it's even more Secondly, I think it's even more important because if the United States negotiates trade agreements and then doesn't carry through, we are in big trouble right away from that score. But I think it's important, thirdly, on geopolitical grounds. Quite clearly, RCEP is there to stay. Quite clearly, the Chinese are having fun, as Fred said, with all this, just waiting for the U.S. to do more stupid things. But on top of that, the Chinese view of what makes sensible economic policy with their state enterprises and stuff is not ours, so it is a different kind of economic world. So I think that TPP is important for all those reasons and others. TTIP, I leave to everybody else. It was less far along in negotiation. On the other hand, it could make enormous sense later on. And of course, if you thought of TTIP and you talk of TTIP at the same time, and then TPP at the same time, you could of course be talking about doing it globally, bringing it all together, which would make even more sense. Two more things. One, we did a lot of talk about the interest rate and the debt and all that. Desmond knows it, but he didn't exactly say it explicitly. If interest rates in this country go up, as the dollar appreciates, it's a double whammy on all the debt abroad, and especially that of corporates in emerging markets. It is not simply the dollar appreciation, which itself would be a problem. It is also that the interest rate, so you've got a double effect very quickly, which could be quite dangerous. And the BIS has been, I think, very strong on this one, and I think I agree that that's important too. Lastly, we haven't talked about how you could get rid of some of the myth about jobs. One of the things that it seems to me all of us have made a mistake on is to take too much account of the notion that more imports mean job loss. More imports also probably means some adjustment in the exchange rate. Some adjustment in the exchange rate probably means some reduction in exports. You don't know exactly where they will come, and you don't know who will not build the factory they would otherwise have built in the United States because of it. But insofar as Boeing loses an order, there are job losses. They are every bit as specific as on the import side, but they're not quite as identified. And I think we've got to stop this business about the gains from opening up trade are all on the consumer side and the costs are all on the producer side. It isn't true. If you look at the U.S. economy, not only do export jobs on average pay more than the U.S., but they're expanding at a reasonable rate. It is not all a one-sided job loss gain. It's a question of who loses, not if somebody loses. And you can't reward the import competing interests and the export competing interests. A fundamental thing that all economists agree on is that a tax on imports, a tariff on imports is a tax on exports and vice versa. You can't do both. And export industries are very important to the United States, and we've got to say more about that instead of talking just about consumer gains. Stop there.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks especially for making that last point. Fred, we're going to give you a chance here, but I want to say also thanks to you for bringing up the Kindleberger point on international leadership. I haven't read that chapter of Kindleberger in a while, and I do think it's really relevant to what we're talking about here. But you have 3 minutes for other things.
Yeah, I have one question and 2 comments. The question is to my neighbor and friend Greg Ip, whose analysis I thought was brilliant. Your nativist versus globalist, that's right at the heart of the issue. I think that gets to the core of where we stand, and that was a brilliant analysis. My question is, when you were discussing Trump's effort to reduce the trade deficit, you kind of dismissed the possibility of leaning on the Fed, and you dismissed the payoff from tariffs, quite rightly, but then you stopped. So you didn't tell us what you thought might be left. Now, I suggested 2 things: that he could shift from direct to indirect taxation and rebate, which would be legal under the WTO, make that part of tax reform, and or, more short run, intervene directly into currency markets, which I suggested might be a disruptive thing and could lead to some currency wars. So I'd be curious as to what you think of those specific proposals, or if you have some other hot idea for them to deal with it. The 2 comments, both to Ann. In her initial remarks, Ann made a couple comments about the WTO and kind of hinted, which some people make more explicit the argument, that the WTO is now in big trouble or even a failure because the Doha round failed. Ann didn't say that.
Yes, it did.
Well, you came pretty close. And I just think that's totally wrong. And if we give that message to Trump and his people who lean that way anyway, we're really doing ourselves a disservice, but also being factually wrong. Why do I say it's factually wrong? I think the WTO is alive and well. look at all the plurilateral agreements that have recently been or are now being negotiated in the WTO or around it. Huge reform of the Information Technology Agreement, over $1 trillion of trade in high-tech products and goods and services has been liberalized. Big negotiation coming close to conclusion, the Environmental Goods Agreement. The Trade in Services Agreement, which picks up the big missed area in the Uruguay round, also getting close to conclusion. Recently, a couple years ago, the Government Procurement Agreement was hugely renegotiated, expanding coverage, liberalization in that big area. So all these areas, while not being done, as Ann would prefer, and I would too, by the full membership of 160 plus countries of the WTO, under its rules of full universal unanimity and all that, while they're not being done under that aegis, they're pretty close because they all cover 80 to 90% or more of world trade. Some of them are even done on an unconditional MFN basis. In the cases that have been done before, like the ITA-1, countries that didn't join at the start came in subsequently, and you're almost up to universal coverage. So it's a pragmatic and de facto way of liberalizing trade at the global level, which we want. The WTO, again, while not the institutional locus of it in the traditional sense of around, is still at the heart of the process. So I regard that as a big victory for the WTO. Add on to that the dispute settlement mechanism, which Ann mentioned, which is a big success. It's the closest thing we've got to a world court in economics. It's very effective. Countries accept its judgments. The US does, China does, almost everybody does. So I regard the WTO as alive and well, and I would hate to give a different message to the Trump people or the world more generally. Finally, most briefly.
I know you have one more comment. You have 1 more minute.
Yeah, I don't even need it. Ann mentioned at the end TTIP. I think we should, and I'm talking here to my European friends in particular, we should be thinking hard about how to save TTIP. TTIP is the one trade agreement that the United States is currently involved in negotiating, or has negotiated in the recent past, which was not attacked by Trump. Not attacked by Trump.
Maybe you didn't know about it.
No. Why was it not attacked? Well, it doesn't raise any of the problems of the people who normally attack trade agreements. It's no low wage partners. It's no low labor standards. It's no low environmental standards. Even the AFL-CIO leadership in the past has said they would support free trade between the US and Europe. So if we're trying to save some pieces from the wreckage and the rest of trade goes down this negative path we fear, I would appeal to my European friends to pick up the ball from their side, because they're the ones who actually have lagged a little worse than the US here in the last few months on trying to bring TTIP forward, to see if we could rescue TTIP, again, largely for geopolitical reasons, to maintain some modicum of transatlantic relations, particularly if NATO is under threat, but also to preserve some modicum of this global economic leadership, forward movement, et cetera, et cetera. I think TTIP is probably the best candidate, or the least unlikely candidate, and if it jumped TPP in the queue, well, okay, but at least it would provide some continued forward momentum. And I think that's very important for the US and Europe to think about very hard.
Thank you. Greg.
So I'll first quickly answer your question, Fred. I mean, you've asked me, okay, so since I've dismissed these other policies as reducing the trade deficit, how would you reduce the trade deficit? Which is like being asked, how would you improve the Washington Capital's win-loss record? I'm just not sure that's appropriate goal of policy. You know what I mean? Like, it's great for Washington, but somebody else has to lose. I just don't see why reducing the trade deficit ought to be a goal of policy. More analytically, I guess I'm in that macro camp, which says that the trade deficit is fundamentally the consequence of a country that consumes more than it produces, and you have to change something to the relative propensities of consumption and production globally to alter that balance. If we leaned on the Fed not to raise rates as appropriate, we would have higher inflation, which would simply cause the real exchange rate to appreciate, and you'd end up with the trade deficit back where it was. These things can have temporary, but in my view, not permanent effects. The only historically guaranteed way to get the trade deficit down is to have a recession. I'm not going to advise Mr. Trump to do that.
Right.
But to reflect on a little bit, Alex, I felt really bad actually afterwards when you pointed out that you wanted somebody to give the bright side and none of us did. So I'm actually going to try and do that, all right? And it's not just pro forma. First of all, we've talked about the impact of a stronger dollar. The stronger dollar will feed back onto U.S. inflation, and the Fed will take that into account in its reaction function, and so that will attenuate its need to raise interest rates. So that will have some positives for those worried about the impact of the strong dollar. Number two, Desmond, you talked a lot about how we have the makings of a crisis in the Eurozone. I think that at the aggregate level, you're absolutely correct, but I think that two things really mitigate against that. Number one, central banks have more or less sedated the global risk appetite with all these oceans of liquidity, which make it almost impossible to have a liquidity crisis. Deutsche Bank is suffering from an existential threat to its ability to ever make money again, but it holds 200 billion euro in cash right now as a consequence of quantitative easing and regulatory policy. It is almost impossible for Deutsche to suffer a liquidity crisis. So I am somewhat positive about the ability to avoid that sort of crisis, at least in the near term. Number three, I think we can all easily lay out scenarios under which Trump, from his stated positions, can be really big trouble for the global economy. I mean, there are those who say the problem with Trump is that we all take him literally, we don't take him seriously. So let's flip it around a little bit. Let's take him seriously, but not literally. And point out, one thing we know about Trump is that he loves to make deals and he sees himself as a deal maker. We know that he has an extremely plastic set of beliefs and that he tends to change them very often. And once again, this is what you see in the world of New York real estate, which is that everybody is your enemy until that day he's your friend, and then you completely flip around. We have seen him put people, nominate people for his cabinet who spoke out very negatively about him on the campaign trail. This, I think, is a sign of somebody who's pragmatic and likes the idea of getting stuff done, even if his idea of what ought to be done is not necessarily where I would start out from. So when he talked about raising 35% tariffs and tearing up NAFTA and so on, you have to see these the way he sees it. These are the opening gambits of a negotiation, and the point isn't to have the negotiation fall apart, it's to get to a deal. And the Mexicans and the Chinese know this, and they know that the point of all these things is to get to a deal. And I actually would rate as higher than 50% the odds that this rhetoric does lead to some sort of tweaking of the various agreements the United States has with these countries without them being torn up. On one of the during the campaign, Trump talked about pulling out of the World Trade Organization. Then later on, as his views became a little bit more refined, he talked about using the WTO and the mechanisms of the WTO to get his way. So I think once he's in president, he begins to see that the existing strictures that he's inherited actually can be used in a way to get what he wants done, and that tweaking them and negotiating within the existing framework is more constructive. And the final point is a lot of the views we've had on macro are predicated on him and the Congress delivering a very large deficit-financed tax cut, fiscal stimulus. Having watched this process now for 15 years in this town, I'm somewhat skeptical that he'll get that. I think there are enough mechanisms in the congressional budget-making process that the Senate minority still has enough sort of leverage to prevent really extreme moves, that there are enough hawks left, especially on the Senate side of the Republican Party, that the deficits that we are likely to see emerge from whatever budget agreement is struck in the next 6 months will be smaller than the numbers we've been talking about.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Greg.
you're right.
Desmond.
Alex, I guess just 2 points I'll make. The first is you wanted an interest rate and a dollar kind of forecast. I would have a very out of the consensus view on that. Given my view as to where the global economy is heading, I'd say that interest rates, while they might rise the next month or two, if you just look a year or two, we're going to see 10-year rates in the United States back below 1%. As the United States becomes the safe haven, the dollar will rise. Now, just in terms of Greg, I think Greg is a little bit too optimistic about the way in which the European Central Bank works, and he might be overlooking the fact that Germany is going to be having an election in September. Mrs. Merkel's star is waning. The Germans aren't exactly jumping with joy about quantitative easing by the central bank and unorthodox monetary policies. They're even less enthusiastic about their exposure to countries like Italy. So I just thought that chart that I put up is an indication of that point, but it is also an indication that we're not on a very long fuse as to when we're going to get real trouble. What this chart is showing is it's showing target 2 balances of Italy that have now exceeded the position that they were at 2012. We're talking about 20% of GDP. These numbers go through September. What it's telling you is that the Italians have been shipping money out of the country in anticipation of a referendum on fear that there was going to be a bad result. How much more so now that you've got political instability, they're not going to be able to fix their banks, you're going to get that money going out, and the Germans aren't going to be too excited to be on the other side of that trade and have an exposure to a country like Italy that'll run in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I'll just remind you that Italy's banking system has something like $4 trillion in assets. That is massive in relation to the size of the German economy. So I'm not as optimistic as Greg is, that somehow they'll print the press, because in Europe, there's not a commonality of purpose. There are Germans and there are Italians, there's the North and there's the South, and they don't feel that they're really wanting to finance. Otherwise, they would have gone to a federal fiscal union, federal banking union. They would have done the whole spiel a lot earlier.
Let me say in Desmond's article, which I quoted, you say that the big crisis as bad as 10 years ago could be as soon as 1 or 2 years from now.
I said 2 years to give myself a little...
Of course. And I will. We mentioned Kindleberger. I'll mention him again. Kindleberger's conclusion was the average recurrence of financial crises is about once every 10 years.
And they normally
on the long view of history.
And they normally have a 7 attached to them. In 1997, 2007.
Greg, you want to make a comment? Then I'd like the panel to think. We're going to get to your questions in just a minute. But while Greg is making his response to Desmond there, real estate only, I think, was mentioned once or twice. We'll see if anybody has a prediction on the effect of real estate prices and real estate markets, which are the biggest asset markets there are of anything we've talked about. That's not a requirement, just if you have one. Greg.
So the Germans hate quantitative easing already, all right? The German government hates it. Wolfgang Schäuble basically blamed it for the rise of AfD. The German representatives on the ECB repeatedly vote against it, and Draghi does it anyway. So the fact that the Germans will hate it even more in 2017, in my view, will not stop Draghi and the ECB from fulfilling their role as lender of last resort. In my view, the ECB now has the tools and the will and the political legitimacy to do whatever it needs to do to prevent a country from being forced out of the euro, but it does not have the ability to stop a country that wants to leave the euro, and that's why I believe the threats are political. If Marine Le Pen becomes president of France and calls a referendum on euro membership, that is an existential crisis that the ECB does not have the ability to solve. Similarly, Five Star Movement forms the next Italian government and calls a referendum on the euro. I worry way more about that than I do about the Italian banking system.
All right, now, anybody have any thoughts on all of the things we've talked about? We have had a tremendous run-up in real estate prices, both housing and commercial. Does this have a connection of all these international things under likely or probable outcomes on real estate markets? With our new administration, with clear real estate connections, as has been pointed out.
Well, just the obvious is, of course, that low interest rates have had something to do with the boom in real estate, and as those interest rates go up, that's obviously likely to have an effect, which probably would be desirable if that scenario plays right. Several people have stressed what about Trump's policies in next year and how expansionary that might be, but I guess my reading, at least of the current reports on where the economy is at, and what I see is that already we are seeing an acceleration in the rate of price increase. We're seeing an acceleration in, fortunately, perhaps the real wage growth and so on, so that we're going to see, even without all that, some inflationary pressure, which also would feed into the housing market, and offset in part by the increase in the Fed's interest rate. So I see the asset price increases as not likely to stop, but perhaps diminish in rate as the interest rate goes up.
Any other forecasts of anything anybody wants to make before we turn to the audience? The audience loves forecasts. So
I'm sure they have questions.
they do. Okay. Forecasts are also welcome from the audience. We'll have the first question over here, and then I'll get back to you, sir. There. May I remind you, please tell us your name and your affiliation, and ask your question. If your question is prefaced by too long a comment, the chair will remind you to ask the question. Yes.
I'm Barbara Bowie Whitman, Whitforest Consulting. There's a broad consensus on the panel that we are at full employment and that drives some other assumptions. One could argue that the election says that people did not believe we're at full employment. And one could argue that maybe the measurement of employment has been adjusted a little to make the current administration look a bit better than their track record might be. So there's another little point I'll stick in before focusing the question for the panel, and that is that one might also be able to argue that perhaps Mr. Trump was taking advantage of a wedge issue on trade because that is the public's perception of what's driving the employment question, and he might be smart enough to know that that isn't what drives it all. Now, come back to how would any of your conclusions change if, in fact, our measured employment statistics do not reflect what's really going on, and that we do have some excess labor that isn't being used?
Okay, thanks. Anybody want to take that?
First, let's just say on the statistics that the statistics are what they are. They're not being manipulated. To charge otherwise is similar to say that President Obama was not born in the United States. I mean, it's that level of disregard of facts. Now, of course, there are different measures. There's ones that include people who have left the labor force or who are discouraged workers or working part-time involuntarily. And as of a few years ago, there was a fair number of those. My view is that, as I read the statistics, that's come down, and that the standard unemployment rate is telling you pretty much the same picture as the other measures. But of course, there is some real economic discontent out there. There has been a big increase in inequality, especially since the turn of the century. Real median family income, even though it was up last year, is still below where it was in 2000. There are real causes of concern, genuine causes of concern out there that need to be addressed.
Okay, I have a question back here, please.
How about?
Oh, I'm sorry, Desmond. I'm sorry.
No, I'd just add to Jeff's point is forget about the employment statistics. You would see it in what's happening with inflationary pressures. You know, that as the economy grows, that you're getting inflation picking up, you know, which would be consistent with the idea that you're more or less close to capacity.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, you okay?
I just don't agree with the premise of your question, which a lot of people share, that you have to turn to these economic and trade factors to explain the election result. You know, a lot of these counties that voted for Trump voted for Obama 4 years ago when the unemployment rate was much higher. I think even in fact in Brexit and Europe, the correlation between unemployment and support for populism is weak to non-existent. And I think it also ignores the entire cultural aspect. I think that this is one thing that Trump has caught on to, and why you see immigration be such a friction point in these things, that a lot of people out there do not like the speed at which the world is changing around them, and that's a factor that's going on here. And the final point is that the polls show us that the majority of Americans support free trade, so it's kind of unusual that you have a president putting so much energy into an issue where there isn't a lot of evidence that that's what people actually want.
Thank you.
Well, and the majority of the population voted for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Thank you for the stimulating question. Now we're going to come to your question.
By a lot.
North Dakota had the highest.
Hi, John Cummings, unaffiliated. I'll ask for predictions here. 2 years into Trump policies, what will unemployment be, GDP, and inflation? Run down the panel, I guess.
Okay. 2019. Anybody want to make a prediction? You'll be on video forever, but then no one may remember it by 2019.
I'd say inflation up. There's a recession out there somewhere, but I'm not going to predict when it's going to happen.
But you'll be the first one to speak out when we actually know, right? That's your job.
He's the
Among other
oracle.
things, there is too much uncertainty right now as to what policies are going to be. And I think it makes it, by 2019, my sort of gradual deterioration scenario in what I think is among the lower cases in terms of being more negative is likely, so that it's hard to say when the recession will hit before that and whether it'll be recession or just gradual decline.
Now, my view would be that we're likely to be struggling with deflation again. You know, that if you do have the kind of crisis that I'm thinking about, you know, and that is a point that perhaps we're not paying sufficient attention to, is that there's a risk that we get a reversal of what happened in 2008, a crisis beginning in the United States, had global implications that sank the global economy. My view is that Europe is so large an economy and we're so intertwined in the financial system that if you do get the euro breaking, that'll be a huge deflationary impact on the global economy and on the United States.
Last Friday, when the great job numbers came out and the unemployment rate went down to 4.6%, there were a lot of people, especially Democrats, moaning over how Trump was such a lucky duck because he was inheriting this amazing economy and this low unemployment rate. So I tweeted out a little chart that said, most recessions begin with the unemployment rate below 5%. None begin with it over 6%. So I don't think Trump should go around feeling lucky. Am I predicting we're going to a recession soon? No, but we are now at 7 years into an expansion. This expansion is much longer than average, so the odds are against him.
Not to mention 7 years into an asset price inflation.
Thank you. Oh yeah, and on your real estate question, you know, I mean, capitalization rates in the real estate sector at all-time lows. I think I will make this prediction: real estate values are are not going to be higher 4 years today than they are in real terms than they are today.
Thank you. I have the gentleman here, and then I'll come up to you. Thank you. Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah.
There's also a question at the back row over there.
I'm Stefan Björklund, living in Switzerland, but I'm Swedish. And I just wonder, I appreciate very much what I heard from Mr. Lachman, especially about debt. Will Mr. Draghi end up as the Dr. Havenstein from the 21st century?
I think it's a question to you, Desmond.
I found the question a little too elliptical. Would you care to elaborate on
This
that?
is the governor of the Reichsbank in the 20s. Will Draghi look the same in retrospect as the governor of the old Reichsbank and the great German inflation looks now to us?
No. I mean, I think that Draghi will go down as having saved the euro at least for a while. You know, that his intervention in 2012 was really something that was remarkably successful, saying that he would do whatever it take. It bought the euro time. Whether or not he did Europe a service is something else. You know, that it would probably have been better for the euro to break and to go forward. But I don't see Draghi leading to a burst of inflation. I think that the risk in Europe is when this thing breaks, you'll get a lot of defaults all over the place. You'll have a lot of banking stresses. You know, that would be consistent with Europe struggling with deflation rather than inflation.
I have a question right here.
Thank you. Sian from the Voice of America. My question is for Mr. Bergenstein. You mentioned in your speech that if the United States retreats and China is not ready to take over the rule as a global leader, so could you elaborate on that? And if China couldn't do that, can Japan be the leader? Thank you.
No, I think the problem is, as I mentioned by analogy with the 1930s on the Kindleberger analysis, that if the U.S. defaults, there's no one yet prepared to step into the breach. I mean, China is the natural contender, as the biggest economy, the biggest trader, the biggest reserves, et cetera, but I think is not quite yet to a point in its role in the world that it could do it in anything like the way the U.S. has in the past. Now, I also did note that China is quite willing, and I think ready, to accept the implications of a U.S. default. I mean, if the U.S. backs away from the world...
By you mean a default in
You don't mean
leadership?
not default on debt.
Leadership default, of course.
Well, you have to be clear.
Trumpian default.
Leadership default. And
He's not ruling out the other type either.
and which would hurt China.
That's right.
But which China will certainly accept, and to a degree, I think, step into those breaches, particularly in the Asian and Asia-Pacific trade context, where it's already involved in alternatives to the TPP, and if the rest of the Asians, including Australia, move in that direction, China will be only too happy to de facto assume the role. But it's way premature to think of the RMB succeeding the dollar.
For sure.
I mean, China's quite consciously wanting to move in that direction, but it's still early days, still huge capital controls, currency still not fully convertible, et cetera, et cetera. So on that side, it's not likely. As a couple people, particularly Desmond, pointed out, China's got its own economic problems right now. It's worried about a depreciation of the currency, capital flight. So it's not really in a strong enough position to step in at this point. So what I fear is a G0 world, where
As you
you
say,
have
unorganized.
where you have no leadership,
Yeah.
and therefore a vacuum, and therefore, as I said, nobody to provide the global public goods that are necessary in tough situations like this to avoid a cascading of international effects. I don't want to undersell the Chinese. They might step up, but I think they're not yet to a point in their revolution. They're still a developing country in per capita income terms. They're still a heavily polluted country working on climate change, but still not there yet. So and that's why I fear a replication of the 1930s, where the incumbent power drops out, but the natural successor is not yet able.
Thank you, Fred. Now we're at noon, but I want to give the back of the room a chance for one more question. I have a gentleman back here, in the back row, and this will be our last question. We're sorry, but the panel will be here for informal discussions afterwards.
Michael Spiro, given your rosy forecast, what kind of portfolio adjustments are you making?
Great question.
These people want brokers, not economists. Don't you know that economists are the worst forecasters of stock prices and these kinds of things? Why do you all ask us those questions? Comparative advantage is not with us on that.
Out of long-term bonds.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but you
Except
said that,
for inflation-protected securities.
you would have said that 3 years ago, too.
It's true.
Yeah, see?
But I bought inflation-protected securities 3 months ago. So.
Okay. There you go.
All right, great. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so happy you've been here, and let's thank our panel for a great discussion.